Done, thanks. So while there is increasing recognition that early childhood spaces are neurodiverse spaces, this still tends to be in the context of thinking about neurodiversity through a deficit lens, and also mostly thinking about children. So while there might be sort of an increasing understanding of the concept of neurodiversity, and that includes things like autism or ADHD or dysgraphia or dyscalculia, there's very little in the way of literature that actually explores the lived experience of teachers. And I'll just say here too that language around neurodivergent, it's problematic. There's a tension there. It assumes a normative idea of what a human brain should do, and it assumes that anything outside of that norm is usually in deficit. Okay, so it is a really problematic term. I'm still using it because it's largely embraced by the neurodivergent community, and when a term is embraced by the community that it seeks to describe, I think that that's a respectful way of interacting with it. So I think that while it's somewhat reductive and it's a binary and it's sometimes not helpful, it's also something that can be useful. And certainly for the teachers who engaged in this project, it was very much something that they saw as validating as a term. So the project is around research creation which reframes the idea that disability and neurological difference are a problem that needs to be solved in education, and it opens a space for those with lived experience to lead that narrative. Okay, so rather than it being led for them. So we're interested here in recognising the strengths and capacities which neurodivergent teachers bring to early childhood settings. So not going about it first from the perspective of what is the most difficult thing for you, but from the capacity of what are you bringing? What is your value in this space? Because we know that there are a number of teachers out there who are bringing a lot to the space. So we're interested in thinking deeply about how neurodivergent adults have strengths which may enhance and positively shape their relationships and care with young children, but also the places and communities with which they work, the extended family networks and things that they're working with. So as well as the ways that neuro-inclusivity might strengthen leadership within early childhood settings. We're interested in identifying and making visible what culturally safe and responsive learning ecologies might look like, and in the context of the workforce crisis. The workforce crisis is largely understood to be the most major significant challenge facing the sector in Australia, and it's a similar situation in many places around the world. I don't know if we could really call it global, but I think it's probably getting close to that. And this is it's not a huge project, it's tiny, but it's an important first step, particularly in this context, in understanding how we attract, support and retain a diverse early childhood workforce, and how we might begin to ensure that teachers and educators experience a sense of safety and a sense of belonging, where their unique ways of being with the world are actually respected and valued. It's amplifying neurodivergent perspectives to inform policy, and doing so through multimodal, multisensory and polyvocal methodologies and outputs. So one of the ways that I'm conceptualising that is that I want the teachers that I teach to feel confident that when they go out into the workforce, they can respond to and create safe places for neurodivergent adults as well as for children, rather than it being simply something that we do for or with children. It's something that we do for or with everybody. There's a QR code here, and if you scan it, it will take you to the project Padlet, which tells you who the research team is, tells you what our research questions were, where our funding came from, etc. So in terms of approach, it's a neurodivergent-led research team. So pretty much everyone on the research team identifies as neurodivergent in some way. Not every single person, but we're privileging perspectives of those with lived experience, be it in terms of, how do you design a research project that will be open to and creative for neurodivergent individuals, but also things like the literature review and policy scan, so making sure that we include own voice narratives and self-advocacy texts that are written by neurodivergent teachers or written by neurodivergent adults to make sure that those voices are leading that narrative. We're obviously using a neurodiversity frame, so a critical and relational restoring approach. Disability studies in early childhood is and tends to be deficit focused, still very much through a medical, if maybe a social lens. When we think about disability as relational, we're working from the premise that neurodiversity is the natural variation of neurotypes in our learning ecologies and communities, and that neurodivergence or atypicality can be both enabling and disabling. It doesn't have to be just one or the other. In terms of, before I go on to that, in terms of criticality and relationality, we're working from the position that disrupting ableism requires attending to the lived experiences of neurodivergent people, so a critical disability studies approach, as well as a recognition that questions of equity and inclusivity require that people without disability see themselves as mutually implicated in processes and systems that both enable and constrain the capacities of others. So when I talk about a learning ecology, I'm talking about the people, the places, the policies, the politics, the pedagogies, the practices that make up a learning environment or a setting, and the systems in which we operate in educational contexts. So the focus of any insights arising from this research is about supporting change in those areas rather than attention to or onus on the teachers to change themselves or to fix themselves or to do something differently to fit in. In terms of an artographic research methodology, we're working in this project from the premise that all teachers are creative, and even though they may not identify as artists, they are all researchers, they are all inquirers, and that those roles are all inextricably linked in with one another. So the A most obviously and usually stands for artivist, though some of us might not feel confident identifying with that term. I like the A to also stand for advocate, for activist. We might think of it here as anti-ableist. For me, it's also autistic. So this conceptualisation, this methodological positionality informs the methods on the move that we're doing in this project. So particularly through the workshops and the co-creation of an online Padlet by the teachers themselves and the resources and short films and videos. By on the move, I mean methods that had and continue to have a responsiveness to creative input from the participants or teachers. So, for instance, as part of the workshops, the teachers curated the Padlet and decided what would be made public and what wouldn't. Thank you, Kate, for suggestion in that as well. So there's some of the ways that we're thinking about it. And the methods are obviously mixed in terms of being both qualitative and post-qualitative. And this is the poster that we used to recruit people, and we put that on social media. We sent that out through teacher networks and had people contact us to participate. So it included 2 online workshops. So teachers worked in their own space with materials of their choosing. We made suggestions to them around things like pencils, textures, magnetic specs, clay, if you have it, whatever you wanted to have on hand, was open to them. We did interviews, so in person and online. They were filmed, some were unfilmed, some are going to be used as part of the videos that we create. Some of them are just being kept as a more traditional source of data. So we found that having multiple ways that people could participate on their own terms was a great opportunity for it to be more responsive to the teachers that we were trying to work with. And then also we had an anonymous online survey. So when we went to design the consent form, Sarah, who's also on the research team, is quite a good Qualtrics user, and she's part of the neurodiversity project that the university is doing on a wider scale. And so she actually pulled some of her questions and we reformulated them into an online survey, so we'd have some data that we could work with as well, which is, you know, not something that I would have done in the absence of having worked with her. So that was also really good. And if you go to this Padlet here, you can actually see the prompts that we used in each of those workshops and the responses that the teachers put on. And the idea initially was to make it public from the outset, and then we, in consultation with Kate, she suggested, you know, that might actually be a little bit, I don't know, just too challenging for people to come at a project for the first time to put things online. And so she suggested, why don't we do it as part of the workshops, and then the teachers can decide for themselves what they want. They didn't decide to take anything off. They all were very open, very generous with their perspectives, and when I gave them that option, they said, actually, no, we've loved these conversations and we want those to be made public, because so many people just don't, unless they are working in a team with someone who's really open and who has already felt safe enough to disclose, they might not have any perspective on this prior. Okay, so emerging insights, what are we finding? So obviously the importance of co-creating research with neurodivergent-led research teams and neurodivergent communities. Kind of can't be overstated how important it is that communities drive their own narratives within educational research. I think that's something that's probably not news to anybody here. so far, the things that the teachers have self-identified are things around emphasising their capacity to connect and empathise, particularly with neurodivergent children. So almost all of them identified that that was a key strength, pedagogical strength, but it was also something that at times could be problematic for them. Okay, so because it might result in, at times, negative attention from leadership and from management around spending too much time with some children over others. Okay, and that was something that came through from a lot of the teachers. Sensorial attunement, so with people and place. So for instance, being able to anticipate when a sensory environment was going to become overwhelming and may lead to shutdown or meltdown for children or for other neurodivergent colleagues. Being able to support colleagues and leadership and families to reframe what might otherwise be framed as challenging behaviours as sensory seeking or communication. Relationships with materials and early childhood spaces. So similar to sensory attunement, the relationships with materials and with textures were highlighted as a key strength. So being able to understand and make sense of what feels safe in a space for children, being responsive to neurodivergent ways of being with the world. Advocacy and representation was another one. So really being able to reframe misconceptions or assumptions about challenging behaviour from more neuro-affirming positionality. So for example, when proprioceptive or vestibular sensory seeking is framed as aggression, or when interoceptive dysregulation is missed or misread as misbehaviour. So neurodivergent educators highlighted that being seen as someone with lived experience often repositions them as an expert within the teaching team and within the community, and often that means that they're someone who becomes sought out by families and by other staff to talk about their experience. So they find themselves obviously more confidently stepping into that role when they felt very safe to disclose and to share their diagnosis with their management and with the service provider or their HR or whoever it happens to be. In terms of challenges, many people talked about the attitudinal barriers, particularly of colleagues and service providers, but the news wasn't all bad here. So many had really positive experiences and were really able to share and flip into that advocacy role once they found their people and found the right fit. So many of them talked about, once I found my people, I was good. But it took me quite a bit of time to find my people. And I gave a presentation about this at the Neurodiversity Research Symposium and also the Faculty of Education Conference, and I posted the video of it to the WhatsApp group that the participants created after the project and invited me to. And one of them watched it and said, I didn't talk about some of those things in my interview, but I see myself in the things that people have identified here, and I realise how much this project has actually validated my experience of being part of this community. So that for me was like a really, really shared response. It was certainly how I felt about doing it, but it was really nice to hear that and to say, I saw those things and I didn't even have to talk about them. This community knew that they were there for me, so that was really good. In terms of challenges, we also had the ideas around sensorially challenging work environments. For anyone who's ever been in an early childhood centre, they stink. They're loud, they're really echoey, they're visually very, very overstimulating for neurodivergent people quite often. So they highlighted that was a challenge, but they also saw it as an area of absolute strength because they were able to share insights and advice and suggestions. So reducing sound through hanging fabrics from the ceilings, or using diffusers, or using practical strategies that they could kind of bring to that space. So increasing outdoor time so that you dilute the sound, sharing larger spaces, having time with animals, having time with preferred textures as part of your routine and your rhythms throughout the day, so that children have opportunities to regulate and adults have opportunities to regulate. If we know it's good for children, we know it's good for adults as well in this context. There were both enabling and disabling aspects of disclosure. So enabling when this was really positively received, for example, teachers found themselves being reframed as kind of lived experience experts, as I talked about before. But this also could be disabling when ignored or when not followed up with the adequate supports or accommodations like sensory breaks or changes to environments to reduce the sound or the overload sensorially. And the last one that I'll talk about was workforce instability and unpredictability. So the workforce shortage often means that there's a reliance on agency staff. We often think about the impact of that on children, and we're quite aware that unpredictable relationships are really difficult. But all of the teachers highlighted that it's actually quite significant for them as well. The over-casualisation and the turnover of staff means that for them the disruption to routine, the disruption to relationships and predictability was also something that was quite difficult to deal with. You know, if the staff member who knows that you don't touch bananas is away for the day and the casual staff member doesn't realise that and says, why didn't you cut up the bananas? Then it creates tension and conflict, and you feel pressured to tell people why it is that you can't do that, and that's not very comfortable for people a lot of the time. And that's, again, the QR code for the project page. So if you wanted to know more or see more, you can have a look.
Amazing. Yay.
And I did that in 50 minutes.
This is unbelievable.
That was good.
I can't believe it. I mean, really, it's quite a nice extension from the idea about risks and responsibilities and the challenges and that sort of cathartic experience of feeling in a safe space, but still taking risks to actually articulate this, and then the sort of impact that has on you to give you confidence to go forward is not you, but the person.
People in general,
yeah,
yes. Yeah, and that was definitely a theme that kept re-entering, or a thread that kept returning, was just that idea of find your people, and once you've found your people, that would help. That the person that messaged me also said, you know, seeing that video and hearing what other people said made me realise that I made certain decisions in my career that can be explained by that. And I should say too, all of these people were women. They were all, if not all, mostly, if not all, late diagnosed women, so went through their entire schooling not realising, not knowing that they were neurodivergent. Some of them did know from teenagehood, but not everybody. So very similar kinds of experiences.
Because I mean, as a term, and the age, given the age of them, it wouldn't have even been a term when they were.
Yeah, or generally in that time,
well, it was a term, but
understood to be, particularly in the context of autism and ADHD, which is the majority diagnosis of what these teachers had, understood to be something that happens to young boys, and they grow out of it. You know, that was very much the understanding through that period of the 80s and 90s. And so, as we understand more, or understand how much we don't know about what those intersections of gender and neurological diversity are. That's bringing all of those things to the fore.
Invisible threads. Have we got some comments or questions or provocations? Or they're all there. It's the end of the day, Amy. You got.
Sorry about that. Yes.
Oh yeah, Annette. Because we're on camera.
Oh. Yeah, I was just thinking, about this wonderful project. Thank you for this. But in relation to the workshops, so when you had the workshops with them, were the questions that you discussed there, were they sort of coming from them, or were they sort of that you had some initial questions, so to speak?
Great question. So this is what the project page looks like, and if I go to, where is it? You can actually see the link to this resource here. So what I did basically was took some basic methods that I thought might work and came up with some of the questions that I wanted to know the answers to. But then we sort of discussed, okay, we can do this for 20 minutes, and we could do this for half an hour.
Do you want to see it from here?
No, that's okay. Can you can't see it. No, sorry, I assumed that when I did that it would. Yeah. Anyway, whatever.
I got the Padlet out.
You can see it later. And so, we had questions because I wanted to provide all of the participants with the questions beforehand. I didn't want them to be walking into that and not knowing what they would be asked. And I also really clearly wanted to say from the outset, you're going to be asked questions about your strengths, your capacities, not about what's wrong with you, or what sorts of therapies you go to, or what sort of hacks you have to survive in a world that's not made for you. I really wanted to clearly frame the way that I was coming at it, rather than it be you're just going to come and kind of take data from me about my deficit and kind of use that against me in some other form or shape. And so, yeah, I did share the questions first. They didn't necessarily know how we were going to do it, and once I introduced the Padlet, that sort of became clear. Some of them already knew how to do that because they'd recently studied, so they had used a Padlet, but some people hadn't.
I'm just re-looking at the Padlet after not looking at it for a while and realising how good it is, and in terms of what Annette's inquiring about, because I mean the very first thing was in 100 words. There's this thing about Kate's and Sarah's 100 words. In what ways has being neurodivergent strengthened your work with young children? And then going right down, it's wonderful in terms of the data you put up there.
Yeah, you can access that. So if you go to this, it'll take you to the research page, and then if you zoom across, go whatever that way is, it'll say online resource, and that's where it is. And I spoke to all of the teachers about, do we want to make it public? Do you want to edit any of your posts first before we make it public? Do you want to have yourself named in terms of your comments? And all of them were happy for that, because it gives you a really clear, really personal insight into what that lived experience is, and they felt there was a significant amount of value in having that available to people. Some of them talked about, I actually want to use this with my staff because I want them to see that it's not just my ways of being in the world, but it's actually shared ways of being in the world as well. Yeah, and a lot of them actually are in positions of leadership and management and quite effective in those roles because they have a really great attunement to how do you support people to be their best in this very challenging environment. So yeah, that was certainly something that came through. And knowing how to support staff that are challenged by the challenges of early childhood.
And that's where the storying methodology was so amazing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
In the school system now are diagnosed with ADHD or whatever. Is it an advantageous that they're taught by a teacher that may also have those sorts of, I call them quirks, but you know, as opposed to, because I know in a lot of the teacher education and a lot of the, going through how to become a school teacher, they don't actually address that as how do you teach kids with, neurodivergent.
Well, they do, but they might address it in slightly different ways. So all courses have requirements that you have to include diversity, equity, inclusion subjects, which is often the subjects that I teach in our Masters of Teaching in Early Childhood and the Grad Dib. But in answer to your question around, is that advantageous? We don't necessarily know that because there isn't research to show us whether or not it is. But in terms of, think about it as walking into a learning setting and knowing that somebody speaks your language. Is that going to put you at ease in a way that helps you to be open to learning new things? Probably more so than if you walk in and you know that nobody speaks your language. And so when we think about neurological difference as a cultural experience or way of being in the world, I think you can probably understand that it's advantageous for teachers to be aware of the ways that their sensorial experiences of the world shape their relationships with children and with places and with spaces. No, so there's more work on primary and secondary, and Matt Harrison has a paper that came out fairly recently where they did this in the context, or not did this, but did a literature review in the context of how much research, what do we know about primary school teachers and secondary school teachers, but they didn't consider early childhood in that research. Yeah. Kate?
I think that's something that we need to consider even when we think about anything to do with disability in education, is that people with disability have less opportunities to actually participate in the systems that we then query. So if we want to look at how many neurodivergent teachers there are, if we want to look at how many deaf and hard of hearing teachers there are, if we want to look at teachers with physical disabilities in wheelchairs, everybody talks about needing to see themselves, but we don't do it when we talk about disability. So we have and disability is cultural. So for me, neurodivergence is cultural. If we talk about culture in school, we've talked about interculturalism today. What does the pluriversal disability idea actually open for us in education is why it's not about the studies, it's about the relative to opportunity. Where are these teachers? How many kids finish school? How many kids finish their university degrees? How many opportunities are made available for people who are neurodiverse? And I think that that's the question that we have to keep asking, and I don't think we do it enough. So we sit in a position of privilege, and I'm freaking lucky that I scraped through every single moment of education. But not everybody has.
No.
And so they're not at the table to then even participate. And why I see and have seen a lot of neurodivergent people and people with all types of disabilities that they claim in art schools, in early childhood settings, is because the standards are lower and people go psycho over it. But that relative to opportunity standard is the thing that makes it equitable. So how we actually revision everything is the language that we need to have, not where are the studies, but why aren't the studies here? Because those people aren't here. The people that are here are the really lucky ones, not the ones, you know, who have the gifted version, because it's not a gift. It's a absolute horror to not work out how to get to school each day, let alone how to get to university and then become whatever it is. I think it almost needs an undoing and a re-looking, which is what this study's doing, but all of education needs to re-look at it.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Who's not at the table for a reason?
Yeah, definitely. And there's, I think, within not only this group, but I think in the larger kind of self-advocacy and own narratives that you read, a lot of people who become teachers who are particularly neurodivergent or that have a disability is because they want to be the teacher that they never had. You know, I want to be the teacher who goes, you don't have to read and write to do literacy, let's dance or do a play or paint a picture or something, because I understand the connections of literacy between those things rather than thinking about it in this really traditional model. So yeah, I think there's definitely space for that, for sure. But yeah, it's quite a small study, obviously. Yeah.
29.
Okay. Is there any more questions? Did that even answer you? I don't even know if you had a question there, Kate. I'm not
No,
sure
it's just ranting.
Yep. No. Angela. What's next for this work? So, still working with the videographer to get the videos to a point where they're small enough, because obviously all of the data that we were generously kind of gifted by all of these teachers, it's really quite detailed and it's really interesting, and so cutting it down and making it into something that you can use in a really quick way that actually gets the message across to people rather than it being a really big conversation is probably the next thing. The teachers themselves, after the project, said we started a WhatsApp group because we want to stay in contact with one another. Do you want to join it? They and I are talking about, you know, how do we support students who come through that want to go on placements but want to go on a placement to a place where they know they're going to be understood as, you know, their first placement or something like that. So I don't know, I don't have a 5-year plan or anything like that, but in terms of small things and in terms of those relationships, there's movement there and there's threads that will keep moving through.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks so much. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Tim, will spin around because I don't know how to get up the Ethiopian